In Chapter 16, we're looking at fiscal policy, which is sometimes the alternative and sometimes the supplement to monetary policy. So whereas the Federal Reserve, which is not part of the government, it's authorized by the government to exist, but it's independent enough of the government as economists think it should be. With fiscal policy, we're actually talking directly about federal government, state government, local governments spending money on goods and services in an attempt to either stimulate or cool down the economy. So, what we saw with COVID was probably the most significant, hopefully in my lifetime, and your lifetime as well, discretionary policy action, which would be that the federal government spent, as the slide says here, $800 billion for households just to keep spending for those first 2 months. And I mean, as a person with 3 kids, I can tell you, I got a lot of money just for having kids with the idea that I would spend it. And I did, so I guess I did my patriotic duty. And as long as people, one of the things you can actually see is that if you look at the poverty rate in the U.S., it actually declines quite significantly in 2020 and in 2021 because of this significant level of spending by the federal government. And again, it was designed to head off or to reduce the severity of the recession that was expected with COVID. State, local, federal government spending money on goods and services. As well, its fiscal policy is the government spending money on transfer payments. So now transfer payments go through one additional step. So when the government buys goods and services, that's pretty easy, right? It would be the government builds a bridge, so it pays the money for the materials, pays the money for the workers, bridge is built, and that money has in essence stimulated the economy. With a transfer payment, such as Social Security, such as food stamps, what you're doing is you're giving it to people to spend, and then you're hoping that they do spend it. You're not directing them where to spend it. Even with food stamps, right? I could use it at Amazon. I could use it for food. I could use it at Walmart for food. I could use it at my local grocery store for food. I could buy, I don't know if it's good or bad, 1 in 5 dollars in food stamps actually goes to soda and other sugar drinks. We can debate about whether people should be buying soda with food stamp money. On the other hand, do we really want to get dictating into what people should and should not be buying, at the grocery store? It's a little difficult to do that. Unemployment insurance would be another example of a transfer payment where the idea is that if someone is unemployed, they usually do spend all of their unemployment insurance money. So it does actually stimulate the economy at a time when it's not doing well. This is all called discretionary fiscal policy, meaning that that a decision is made to spend more money. With things like unemployment insurance, these are automatic stabilizers, meaning that because of the way they're set up, where it pays out only when someone becomes unemployed, well, that would happen when a recession is happening. So these are called automatic stabilizers. And they work much faster than discretionary fiscal policy. Okay, so we have automatic stabilizers, discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary means you have to make a decision to spend money. Automatic, you don't really need to make any changes. It just happens as a result of other things happening. And again, it can work in the same 2 directions. It can either be expansionary, where if it's expansionary, what we're talking about here is one of 2 things. either the government spending more money, or as Republicans tend to do, say taxing less, with the idea that that in turn leads to people consuming more and businesses doing more investment, as opposed to contractionary, which would mean that the government is spending less, or that taxes go up, which means that consumption goes down and investment goes down. And we can see pretty clearly we spend a lot of money. And the federal government is when we talk about government purchases, the federal government is the largest player in this. Spending some 70 cents of every government expenditure represents the federal government. And obviously that picked up significantly during COVID. And then when we look at the role of these purchases within the entire GDP, interestingly, what we see is that in terms of direct purchases of goods and services, this is steadily falling. Instead, what we're seeing is that a lot of money, so the GDP, so the federal government spending has risen to about 30% of GDP, but that a good deal of that is actually transfer payments to individuals, not the government actually just directly buying goods or services. And that's what we see here. So 47.9% of all government spending is on transfer payments. What would that be? That would be things, again, like food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, unemployment insurance, disability insurance. All of that is parts of transfer payments. That's giving money to people for meeting certain conditions. What's interesting is that, okay, so we could look at the interest payments, that's almost 12%. The rest of it, let's say defense spending at 15.3%, we kind of debate about that from time to time. But look at that, the rest of it would be like other expenditures. That would be like all the other stuff that we, can complain about, or grants to state and local governments. I don't know, like funding local libraries, giving grants that are used to pay for, like, let's say Medicaid payments, or payments to other groups within a community. But the bulk of the conversation seems to typically be about these other expenditures. And we can also have a debate too about whether businesses need to be subsidized to do what they do to the tune of 2%. What would that be? That'd be like giving tax breaks to solar installation companies or to electric car companies, things like that. Where's all that money come from? Well, most of it comes from me and you. That would be the individual income taxes, making it over half. 32.8% is the social insurance taxes. You would see these on your paychecks as FICA, typically, as well as the Medicare. So that's the bulk of everything else. Corporate taxes, less than 7%. And then the other taxes and sources of revenue, that would be things like tariffs, things like that. Excise taxes on specific goods like alcohol or tobacco. The biggest problem we have that we need to solve somehow is the fact that Social Security, which emerges in the 1930s, was built in a demographic time period where we had more workers that were contributing to the system than we had people collecting. Medicare, when it emerged in the 1960s, and the population was getting a little older, but it was really, really cheap to provide medical care. But now it has grown, and as you see right here, Medicare and Medicaid, health care for the poor is Medicaid, health care for the elderly is Medicare, And if you're both poor as well as elderly, then you actually can collect both Medicare and Medicaid, which is typically called Quest, where Medicare pays out first and then Medicaid covers whatever Medicare doesn't cover. I mean, we talk a lot about whether Social Security will exist when we retired. Probably the bigger concern would be is whether Medicare will exist when we're there. If we actually wanted to look at whether they will exist, we could look at the Medicare actuarial report. And the Medicare actuarial report, which came out about, 2 months ago from the date I'm making this lecture. Where's the 2024 data? We just stopped making the report. No, okay. I mean, sure, I'll just look at Social Security Trustee report. So the Old Age and Survivors Insurance 2033. That's the primary one. This is the primary trust fund that you and I would use when we retire. So that's in 9 years. After 9 years, it will still exist, but it'll only be able to pay about 79% of benefits. The disability insurance program has enough money all the way through 2098. I'll be long dead by that point. If you combine both of these funds together, meaning you use the disability insurance trust fund to subsidize the old age and survivors insurance trust fund, then you get out to 2035. But then both of them could only pay 83% of their benefits. That's pretty bad. Meaning that we need to do something about this. This is pretty bad. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get elected or reelected by dealing with this issue directly. As you can see here, really the only things we can do is either increase Social Security taxes, decrease the benefits, or decrease when it is you become eligible, meaning you can't collect it until a much older age. The last time the age was changed was 1983. When I was 6 years old. Yeah, and I think that's also the last time taxes changed too. So obviously a lot has changed even in terms of demographics since 1983, and this just needs to be revised. Now, I make this lecture in November of 2024 when we're, have just elected or re-elected, however you want to interpret it, Trump is into president as well as a Republican Senate, and I'm not sure if it's a Republican House as well. But in any case, right, that's kind of what's being, considered and thought about, in behind closed doors is how are they going to spend, what changes are they going to make to how the government spends money and how it imposes taxes. In this environment. Yes, if we were facing an economic crisis, we could talk about this. As an attempt to stabilize the economy, but we don't really have that problem. For the most part, we're talking about this from the perspective of, promoting the aspects of the economy that the Republicans want to promote, and not funding things that is not a priority for them. Either whether I agree or not as a individual doesn't matter. Right? In this case, this would be what the Republicans are pursuing, not in an attempt to stimulate the economy or stabilize the economy, but in an attempt to kind of put into action what their priorities are. And they do it through changing government purchases, changing taxes. And here we can see, kind of similar to how we did expansionary monetary policy, Here we've got expansionary fiscal policy, which now means that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right as government spending, or G, increases. And so you see this here, right? This would have been what would have been attempted in March of 2020 during COVID. And to the contrary, you would see contractionary fiscal policy, which I think, in my opinion, is a unicorn. I don't think you would see this very often, where the government says there's too much inflation, we need to reduce spending because there's so much inflation. Good luck. I just don't think it's going to happen. But what we also see, and we saw this at least one meaningful time during the Trump administration, the first one, was that the economy basically shut down with COVID, which shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. What we could also, though, see, too, is that sometimes the government alone shuts down, right, when there's a disagreement between, Democrats and Republicans. And if the government shuts down, that would also decrease the aggregate demand curve, or shift it to the left. And so we see, similar to how we had for monetary policy, this kind of comparison between the expansionary and contractionary policy, and the end goal being that you either are trying to increase government spending to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, or with contraction you're trying to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left in an attempt to slow down the economy. Same as before, we can imagine as well that this doesn't always have to happen in a static fashion, that this can happen dynamically. And again, makes it much more difficult to get any specific outcome if every curve is changing as it does over time. The other side to this would be that if we have this working in the for contrary fiscal policy in a dynamic model, what you could see is that, again, same difficulty exists, except now we could unexpectedly cause much higher inflation than we would have intended. Now, when we talk about how the government spends money, the most obvious way it does this is through these autonomous increases in aggregate demand, meaning that the government just spends more money. So that, it changes regardless of how people are behaving. The alternative to this would be that, sometimes we might think that the multiplier changes, meaning that how the spending occurs could cause kind of ripple effects in the economy. That, let's say, a person gets a government contract, the government spends money to give money to that person who's doing the work of the contract, but then they in turn spend the money, thus causing a multiplier of the original amount that was spent. The government can take actions that influences that multiplier effect. And it becomes really important, if you're engaged in this kind of policy, to know what your multiplier is. Because it basically means that if you know the amount of the gap that you have, let's say it's the recessionary gap or inflationary gap, you would then know how much you need to stimulate or kind of take out of the economy as government spending in order to get the desired effect over time through the multiplier. And here you kind of just see this, new description of Java, new version of just Java. Here you get this kind of just graphical description of what's going on. That, government again makes an initial, let's say, $100 billion purchase, and then looks like they're spending about 50% of the money each and every time, right? And so now the cumulative effect is growing much larger by knowing that that multiplier, in this case, that the amount spent is 0.5. We know that we have a multiplier of 2. That basically, with that multiplier of 2, the government needs to only do half the work. Where that multiplier was my change in real GDP, which was 200 billion over 100 billion, the initial change in government purchases. The larger the multiplier, the less work that the government needs to do. Just as we have a government purchases multiplier, we also have a tax multiplier. The tax multiplier generally is going to be a negative number, because when you increase taxes, GDP gets smaller, and vice versa. And then, let me just pause here. So when we look at, the difference between how things are stimulated by Republicans versus Democrats, Democrats traditionally make a pretty straightforward argument that to stimulate the economy, the government needs to spend more money. And that as the government spends more money, that money in turn is spent more by people and businesses. Just because of their philosophical differences, Republicans in general, at least historically, favored smaller government. And so the idea of having the government spending the money isn't desirable to them. Their idea tends to be that people spend their money probably better or more efficiently than the government does, and so we just need to give people more of their money back, meaning that we would do tax cuts. And so theoretically, there's nothing different with regard to the Republican approach or the Democrat approach. But the one difference is whether people are going to actually spend the money that they don't spend out in taxes. Meaning what they could end up doing is saving it instead. And so we saw that Republicans that took more office in 2010, Obama had been elected in 2008, and then in 2010 we had those, what were they called? They were called like the Tea Party or something. And those Republicans pushed for tax credits, basically reduction in taxes. And so theoretically, people then would have a disposable income that goes up, with the idea that they would then spend that money. And graphically, we can understand it as this, that we'd be going from point A to point C. But what we also see is that the GDP does go up, but again, we see that same consequence of the price level going up. And probably more concerning is the fact that the price level went up a lot more for a very small change in the real GDP, from 19.9 trillion to 20 trillion. In general, economists, they actually tend to be more Republican and more conservative than the regular population. But in general, most economists slightly favor government stimulus over tax cuts, in general, for the most part. Theoretically, again, whether you use an increase in government purchases or you cut taxes, it would have the same positive multiplier effect. And it can work in the reverse direction, where we could decrease government purchases and increase taxes to have a negative multiplier. It's just that the problem, right, if we're looking at this here, So you would use this if you had a recessionary gap. Sorry. So you would use the expansionary fiscal policy if you had a recessionary gap. But what you see over here would be if you had an inflationary gap. And this would be what we would call contractionary fiscal policy. The problem with this is that even if you should be doing it, meaning that the government, even if you should be doing it, even if the graph shows that you should be imposing contractionary fiscal policy, it tends not to be done. And the reason why it tends not to be done is that neither of those sound like positive political actions, right? That you're going to say that you're going to spend less or that you're going to raise taxes is not going to get you elected or reelected. Additionally, when we look at some of the difficulties of fiscal policy, one of the really big ones is crowding out. So this lists two things here, timing and crowding out. Let's talk about crowding first, because that's more important. And this is the big one, and it's legitimate, of what conservatives say for a negative for government spending, is that if the government spends more money, it tends to crowd out private spending. And the critique of that would be is that market participants, like me and you as customers, are pretty responsive, right? If we don't like something, we just stop buying it. If we like something, we start buying it. And we move much faster. Government doesn't tend to do that, right? It would tend to buy the same thing even far beyond long after it's no longer needed or wanted. And additionally, too, it can overstate the impact of fiscal policy. So if the government spends a lot more money on libraries, they could sound really good, like you're really stimulating the economy, but the problem would be is that people will just spend less on their own books, right? Because they can just go to the library and get them for free. The timing also tends to be pretty difficult with fiscal policy, though, too. And it's just that it takes a long time for a bill to become a law and for the government to actually then spend that money. And so there's a lot, these are the big reasons why, in general, economists are not in favor of using fiscal policy and that they generally prefer monetary policy. And so this kind of raises the question of why was the recession of 2007-2009 so severe? Again, this is around the time that most of you were born, so I recognize that you might not all appreciate how difficult it was. But if you look at just this data here, that a typical post-World War II recession was about 10 months, but that the recession of 2007 to 2009 was a year and a half, right? Almost double the amount of time. And that furthermore, the unemployment rate was higher, as was the decline in real GDP. I mean, that's significant. I mean, if you think about how nice your life has been, for most of you who was born at the 2007-2009 financial crisis, you've only experienced one recession, an incredibly very brief one in 2020. This recession, I don't remember the recession that I was when I was 2 years old. I'm told it was pretty bad, though. That would be the recession of 1980. But yeah, this was a pretty bad recession. So what made it so bad? Well, if we look at this and we call it just a housing crisis, which tends to be done, we could see that, yeah, I mean, it really did affect housing prices, right? Housing prices fell quite dramatically. this was in general a pretty global event, right? And we can see with the number of countries how many countries experienced this financial crisis. But also, what we can see here is that, at least in this recession, the reason why it was so severe was that it was a recession that emerged out of a financial crisis, and it highlights how important um, a financial system is in an economy. That essentially, in this case, because the financial system neared collapse in the United States and in most other countries, that it took a lot longer for recovery because that financial system was so weak. Why does that matter? Because you need a financial system for people to have access to reliable access to their savings, and that additionally you need a strong financial system so that you can borrow money and take risks, and that would help the economy grow more in the future. Here you can kind of see graphically this crowding out that I've already talked about, and where this crowding out is happening. You can see that basically the aggregate demand curve doesn't shift as much as it originally would have. Whereas it would have moved from 81 to 82 had there been no crowding out. Instead, it moves to 82, but with some crowding out. And a bigger kind of critique here, though, as well, is that in the end, the belief is that even if you do spend more money and stimulate the economy, that the problem is that it doesn't stimulate the economy over the long run. And in the long, all this is a temporary band-aid to fixing the economy. But we still do it because, in the moment you do it just to worry about tomorrow. And all you're doing is pushing forward some consumption that would have happened a little bit later. I'm going to skip this here, only because, yeah. No, I'm just going to skip it. Sorry, I'm just trying to decide what I want to be able to cover here or not. I'm just going to skip over the rest of this discussion of the 2008-2009 crisis. It's getting a little bit technical here, and I don't think you need to worry about that. But what that takes us to then is talking about this bigger issue that many of you probably think about or have heard about, which would be is that basically the federal government is spending too much money. That we have a situation where we are running a deficit, where the amount of government spending is greater than the revenue we're bringing in. It hasn't been since the late 1990s that we've run a budget surplus, and even then it was only about a year or two. For the most part, having a budget deficit is as American as apple pie. And those deficits add up annually to contribute to our government debt. Now, let's look at how big this is and how bad this is. So you can type in US debt clock and you see this horrible looking, both looks bad as a numeric thing, but also looks bad because it's just like a data mess. Look at this thing. So the amount of US debt we have right now is $36 trillion. That's a lot of money. You can kind of see all the other things kind of growing here, but let's just focus on this US national debt. We could look at it for Hawaii. Let's see if they've got one for Hawaii. Never mind, I don't think they do. Jeez. It's a mess. They say it looks like a mess just because it's a lot of numbers going on here. Okay, well, I can't get it to do that, so never mind. Well, there you go, right? We can see these are the deficits. This is not the debt. So the deficits would be the annual shortfall. Obviously, our biggest annual shortfall would be at the beginning of World War II, where we spent a lot of money, and we still had a recession, or the Great Depression was still ending, so people weren't putting in a lot of money. So the U.S. faced a real financial crunch during World War II. How would we finance it? Which would be why typically when you hear about World War II and whatnot, you also hear about these bond drives and how they needed workers to buy U.S. government debt. Well, it's precisely for that reason. We can see that up until the Reagan administration, we tried to keep the deficit quite small. But that during the Reagan administration and then even during the subsequent Clinton administration, the deficit grew larger. Now, the Clinton administration at least did have, this kind of recovery back up to here where we did run a surplus. And even after the 2008, 2009 crisis, towards the end of the Obama administration, we did get here. And so when I look at this, and I'm not trying to get too political here, but I'm not too certain why Republicans always try to come across as being fiscally responsible, because we do see these deficits growing here. We see the deficit growing during the Bush administration. Now, we did have a war on terror, but it did grow here. During the Reagan administration, I don't know. It's probably much more complicated than I'm making it seem. And I'm sure there's more of a richness to the data, just to be balanced here. I don't think Republicans are lying any more than Democrats are lying. But they should just both say, in this case, they should just both say that they're overspending money, because it clearly looks to be the case. Now, one of the things that, starts to come into the conversation as well is trying to use the federal budget as a way to stabilize the economy. And that what we need to do is look at what would the budget deficit or surplus have been had the economy been doing very well, right? Or in other words, we could look at this and say the economy was doing really, really well in the late 90s. Even though it was running a deficit, it should have been probably a surplus given how strong the economy was growing. Or we could say the economy grew really, was obviously getting really, was undergoing a recession because of COVID-19, and so the deficit naturally grew. Is it really that bad? I mean, maybe it wasn't, just because there was already a recession. So the idea is that we should cyclically adjust that budget deficit or surplus to everything else. And then you also get this argument where people say that we should balance the budget, right? That we should be fiscally more responsible, and we should make it a law that you have to balance the budget. For the most part, economists are against that. And the reason why economists are against that, for the most part, is because it is just a statement of the reality of the world, that the government does need to spend more money when we're in a recession to help us get out of it, just from a Keynesian perspective. And so you need to you just need to run a deficit when the economy is not doing well. Now, if we look at the debt, which again is the summation of the deficits, first thing you see is that having debt is as old as the country itself. But I think we can all agree something is clearly different today. And the thing that is clearly different today is that our debt today is, as a percentage of the GDP, as high as it was when we were fighting Germany and Japan in World War II. And we're not fighting Germany and Japan anymore. So this is becoming unsustainable. And if the projections follow through, I mean, by this point, I don't care, me personally, I'll be dead by this point, but you will all be responsible for this. And it certainly would seem like we're not being responsible, at least my generation. Generation X is not being responsible to your generation. When we look at who owns that debt, most of that debt is owned by us, meaning it's owned either by us, the actual public, which would be U.S. non-bank public. That would be this 28% right here. That'd be like me and you owning parts of the debt. Federal Reserve, big holder of the debt. And then other agencies within the government would hold U.S. government debt as they have extra savings. So that's almost, what, 2/3? Social Security Trust Fund is right here in the intergovernmental holdings. That's a big chunk right there. Then you've got U.S. commercial banks, which are required to buy U.S. government debt if they want to buy a security. That puts in another 10%, which basically means that 20% of the debt is owned by countries other than the U.S. So there's a part of me that doesn't worry too much because, I mean, we basically do owe the money to ourselves. We're not at risk of being taken over by some other country who decides to, demand payment back. It's just not the case. Yeah, 23%. Just writing this down here. 23% of the debt owned by foreign central banks, foreign commercial banks, and foreign investors. So when we look at, is this debt a problem? My general take is no. This also seems to be the point of view of the authors as well, that there's no serious risk of defaulting on its obligations. And it's true, the interest rate that we borrow is pretty low. And the interest payments, we can at least make interest-only payments, and they're not that unreasonable. The part of the problem, though, that we might want to highlight here, though, is that what are we incurring all this debt for? If we're not incurring it to build a military or to build infrastructure, but instead we're just making payments to people for different things, we might be concerned about what we're incurring that debt for and whether that's helping us. This leading theory that much of this then comes down to is, again, what's called modern monetary theory, or MMT. And I will admit I'm also a bit of a believer in this modern monetary theory, which basically, again, does say that the debt itself is unimportant. The biggest issue the biggest issue that we face, I guess, with this this debt and the deficit is whether it brings about higher inflation or not. MMT basically says that it shouldn't, because basically monetary policy monetary policy itself is just basically counteracted by what the private spending is. We don't really know, to be honest. Modern monetary theory really is only about a 10-year-old theory. It certainly seems to be what's being relied upon right now in government about why we shouldn't care about how much is being spent. It's just that most of the rest of the discipline doesn't seem to be entirely convinced about that and whether it brings on more inflation. Okay, finally, we get to how can fiscal policy encourage or discourage economic growth. And this goes back to what I was just saying, is what are we incurring this debt for? If we're doing it to build infrastructure, doing it to promote technology, then we would think that the fiscal policy in the long run is promoting economic growth. If it's not, then maybe we should be more concerned, because it's not going to be shifting out the aggregate supply function if we're just giving people money for, I don't know, for, because their last name starts with S, which would be pretty great. Okay. I'm going to skip some of these slides because it's not that important here. Let me do these last two here. Let me just focus on these last two. The final thing that we'll probably hear a bit about is how tax rates, the fact that they matter. And we're certainly going to see this during the upcoming Trump administration. And we saw that because when the idea is that they reduce taxes on individuals, that individuals will then work longer hours, buy more stuff. And this was at least a proposal during the Trump administration of no taxes on tips or no taxes on overtime. The idea was that it would make people work more and that they would spend more money. We don't know whether that really, in reality, really truly happens. We do know under the first Trump administration that there was a great deal of cuts to corporate income taxes, as well as cuts to taxes, especially on capital gains. It's also unclear about whether that encouraged businesses to do more, build larger. The other critique that's made is whether people would comply with the tax code more if we just made it simpler to file taxes, right? Like we all seem to use TurboTax, but still that it takes people, I guess here it's saying 45 hours per tax return to do it, that we would pay more in taxes, that more of us would pay taxes if it was easier to do. I don't know about that. In general, economists don't really take a stand on this. We do have a complicated tax code, but it's complicated because essentially what the tax code does is it reallocates income from poor individuals, or to poor individuals from richer individuals. I think it's a lot harder to figure out who's rich and who's poor and who's doing what you want them to do. You only seem to be able to do that by asking a really long series of complicated questions and calculations. Okay. We're not covering the appendix, so that's it.